Sometimes the people we stop seeing are the ones who were quietly changing us all along. Every weekday at exactly 8:12 a.m., a black sedan eased to the curb in front of the towering glass headquarters of Carter Global in downtown Chicago. The revolving doors spun without rest as executives hurried inside with paper cups of coffee, security badges clipped to tailored jackets, and eyes fixed on another demanding day. It was a rhythm so predictable that no one questioned it anymore. Not the doorman who greeted familiar faces, not the security guards who rotated shifts with military precision, and certainly not Ethan Carter, the 42-year-old CEO whose calendar measured life in 15-minute increments. He stepped out of the car the same way every morning, adjusted the cuff of his navy overcoat, accepted a leather portfolio from his assistant, and crossed the polished sidewalk without slowing down. But on this particular Monday, something interrupted a routine that had remained untouched for years. It wasn't a phone call. It wasn't breaking news from Wall Street. It wasn't a board member waiting by the elevator. It was an empty corner. Ethan stopped for only a second, barely long enough for anyone else to notice, yet long enough for something unfamiliar to stir inside him. The spot beside the stone planter, where a little girl usually stood holding fresh flowers wrapped in brown paper, was empty. No bucket filled with daisies. No tiny folding stool. No cheerful handwritten sign that simply read, "Fresh flowers, $5." Most of all, no quiet smile waiting for strangers who rarely smiled back. Ethan frowned without understanding why. He took another step toward the entrance, then looked back over his shoulder. The corner remained empty beneath the cool October sunlight. It felt strangely unfinished, as though someone had erased a detail from a painting his eyes had memorized without asking permission. The lobby doors opened automatically, but instead of walking through, he found himself searching the sidewalk one more time. Nothing. His assistant noticed his hesitation. "Everything okay, Mr. Carter?" she asked softly. Ethan blinked, almost embarrassed by the question. "Yes," he answered automatically, though the word felt oddly uncertain. They continued inside, swallowed by marble floors, quiet elevators, and the familiar scent of polished wood and fresh coffee. Yet all morning, between quarterly reports, investment calls, and presentations projected across conference room walls, his attention drifted back to that empty corner. He couldn't remember the little girl's name. In fact, he wasn't sure they had ever exchanged more than a few words. Still, every morning for what must have been 6 months, she had been there before he arrived, arranging small bouquets with patient hands no larger than the flowers themselves. Every morning, she offered the same gentle greeting. "Good morning, sir." And every morning he acknowledged it with little more than a distracted nod, if that. Somehow, without realizing it, her quiet presence had become part of the architecture of his life. Now that she was gone, the silence she left behind felt louder than the traffic echoing through downtown Chicago. For the first time in years, Ethan Carter walked past the floor-to-ceiling windows of his own office and found himself looking down at the street instead of up toward the future. 6 months earlier, that same corner had been nothing more than another piece of downtown Chicago that Ethan Carter never noticed. His world existed several stories above the sidewalk, where glass conference rooms overlooked a city that seemed to move only for him. Every morning began before sunrise with financial reports waiting on his tablet, conference calls stretching across time zones, and an assistant who measured his day more accurately than any clock ever could. Success had become a machine, and Ethan had become the man who kept it running. His penthouse overlooked Lake Michigan, yet he rarely paused long enough to admire the view. His refrigerator was always stocked, but he almost never ate at home. Awards lined the shelves of his office, photographs from magazine covers decorated the reception area, and business journals called him one of the most disciplined executives in America. Still, when the lights of the city reflected against the windows each evening, the silence inside his office always arrived before he did. Then, one crisp April morning, as his driver slowed near the front entrance, a splash of white caught Ethan's attention for only an instant. A little girl stood beside the stone planter, carefully arranging fresh daisies into neat bundles tied with faded blue ribbon. She could not have been older than 8. Her backpack rested against the planter, nearly as large as she was, and beside her sat a small metal bucket filled with water to keep the flowers fresh. She smiled at every person who walked past, whether they looked at her or not. Some politely declined. Others hurried by without slowing down. A few stopped to buy a bouquet before work. Ethan stepped from the sedan without changing his pace. As he passed, the little girl looked up with bright eyes and offered a smile that seemed untouched by the rush surrounding her. "Good morning, sir," she said warmly. Ethan gave the slightest nod without breaking stride. The elevator doors closed behind him, and within seconds she had disappeared from his thoughts. The following morning, she was there again. "Good morning, sir." Another nod. Another busy day. Then another morning. And another. Spring slowly gave way to summer, and summer softened into early fall. Rain soaked the sidewalks more than once, but the little girl always found a way to protect the flowers beneath a clear plastic sheet. On windy mornings, she held the bouquets close to keep the petals from scattering. On especially hot afternoons, she replaced the water before the stems began to droop. Ethan never asked why she sold flowers before school. He never asked her name. Yet somewhere beneath deadlines and shareholder meetings, his mind quietly began expecting that gentle greeting before the building doors opened. It became as dependable as the sunrise, as ordinary as the sound of the revolving doors turning behind him. Without realizing it, Ethan had started measuring the beginning of each workday not by the time displayed on his watch, but by the quiet voice waiting beside the planter. He still believed he was ignoring her. The truth was far more surprising. His heart had already begun, remembering someone his mind had never taken the time to know. As the weeks slipped quietly into months, the people passing through Carter Global changed with every season, but Lily never seemed to miss a morning. She arrived before the first wave of commuters, carefully setting her small bucket beside the planter before arranging each bouquet with remarkable patience. She never called out to customers or begged anyone to stop. Instead, she simply smiled, as though she believed kindness was something people would eventually notice if she offered enough of it. Ethan continued living inside the relentless rhythm of meetings, negotiations, airport terminals, and late-night strategy sessions. Yet without realizing it, small details about the little flower seller began settling into the corners of his memory. On rainy mornings, she wore a bright yellow raincoat that was slightly too large for her. On windy days, she tucked loose strands of blonde hair beneath a faded blue knit cap before straightening every bouquet again. When delivery trucks blocked the sidewalk, she quietly stepped aside so strangers could pass without inconvenience. She thanked every customer with the same genuine smile, whether they bought one flower or 5 bouquets. Most surprisingly, she seemed to remember everyone. The security guard always received the first daisy of the week because, according to Lily, Mondays deserved encouragement. The crossing guard across the street sometimes found a tiny bundle of wildflowers waiting beside his coffee before sunrise. Even the woman who swept the sidewalks each morning once left carrying a bouquet, tied with a handwritten note that simply read, "Thank you for making our street beautiful." Ethan never stopped long enough to witness every exchange, but fragments found their way to him. One receptionist mentioned that the little girl somehow remembered birthdays better than the office calendar. A maintenance worker laughed about how she insisted flowers looked happier when someone smiled while holding them. Even Ethan's driver admitted he occasionally bought bouquets from her to bring home to his wife because, as he quietly confessed, nobody could walk away from that child without feeling just a little lighter. Ethan pretended not to listen. Still, each morning when his car approached the building, his eyes drifted almost automatically toward the familiar corner before he stepped onto the sidewalk. He told himself he was simply checking traffic. He told himself it meant nothing. But every time Lily spotted the sedan, her face brightened with unmistakable recognition. "Good morning, sir," she would say, as though greeting an old friend instead of one of the busiest men in Chicago. One cool September morning, she held out a single white daisy as Ethan passed. "This one is for you," she said with a gentle smile. Ethan slowed, surprised. "I did not order any flowers," he replied politely. Lily shook her head. "I know. Sometimes people need flowers before they know they need them." Ethan hesitated, then accepted the daisy almost awkwardly. He reached into his pocket for his wallet, but Lily took a small step backward and smiled again. "It is already paid for," she whispered. Before he could ask what she meant, another customer approached her stand, and she turned to greet them with the same warmth she offered everyone else. Ethan carried the single flower upstairs without understanding why he could not bring himself to throw it away. Instead of leaving it on his desk, he placed it in a glass of water beside the window overlooking the city. For the next several days, whenever difficult meetings tested his patience, his eyes wandered toward that quiet white blossom, and somehow the room never felt quite as cold as it once had. Monday became Tuesday, and Tuesday quietly slipped into Wednesday. The corner beside the stone planter remained empty. At first, Ethan convinced himself there had to be a simple explanation. Perhaps the weather had turned colder than expected. Perhaps the little girl had taken a day off from school activities. Perhaps someone in her family had asked her to stay home. Reason supplied endless possibilities, but none of them settled the uneasy feeling that followed him from one meeting to the next. By Thursday morning, he caught himself looking toward the sidewalk before his driver had even brought the sedan to a complete stop. The empty space greeted him again. It no longer looked like an ordinary stretch of concrete. It looked abandoned, as though the city itself had misplaced something important. Ethan stood there for a moment before walking inside, earning a curious glance from the doorman who had opened those same doors for him every weekday over the past decade. During lunch, he found himself staring at the white daisy still resting in the small glass vase on the corner of his desk. The petals had begun to curl, yet somehow it remained the only object in his office that felt personal. He remembered Lily's quiet words. Sometimes people need flowers before they know they need them. For the first time in years, Ethan realized someone had offered him kindness without expecting anything in return. Late that afternoon, instead of heading directly to another conference call, he walked downstairs alone. The October air carried the scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby street vendor, and commuters hurried toward the train station with scarves wrapped tightly around their necks. Ethan crossed the sidewalk until he reached the familiar planter. There was no bucket, no folding stool, not even a forgotten ribbon. It was as if Lily had never been there at all. He looked toward the security desk just inside the lobby. "Have you seen the little girl who sells flowers?" he asked. The guard looked surprised. "You mean Lily?" Ethan repeated the name quietly, almost testing it for the first time. "Lily." The guard nodded. "She has not been here all week. Do you know why?" The man shook his head with genuine regret. "I wish I did. She always brought everyone a smile before work. It feels different around here without her." Ethan thanked him and continued walking down the block. He stopped beside the coffee cart where a woman had served employees every morning for years. Before he could even ask, she sighed softly. "You are looking for the flower girl, are you not?" Ethan nodded. "Have you seen her?" The woman wiped her hands on her apron before answering. "Not since last Friday. She looked tired that morning, but she still smiled." She always smiled. Ethan felt a quiet weight settle inside his chest. Did she say where she was going? The woman hesitated for only a second. She mentioned she needed to get home early because her mother was not feeling well. She looked toward the empty corner and lowered her voice. "I hope everything is all right." Ethan followed her gaze. The evening sun stretched long shadows across the sidewalk, but one small shadow was missing. As he turned to leave, something near the base of the planter caught his attention. Tucked carefully behind the stone was a single brown paper sleeve, slightly worn by the wind. He bent down and picked it up. Inside rested one dried white daisy and a tiny handwritten card. Across the front, in careful childish handwriting, were 7 simple words that made him stop breathing for just a moment. "I will come back when Mommy smiles again." Ethan slipped the small card into the inside pocket of his coat and stood motionless as evening settled over Chicago. The city continued moving around him with its usual urgency, yet everything suddenly felt slower, quieter, more deliberate. During the drive home, he never opened his laptop, ignored 3 incoming calls from board members, and barely noticed the skyline reflected across the windows of the sedan. His thoughts remained fixed on 7 handwritten words that no quarterly report could explain. The next morning, he arrived earlier than usual. Instead of walking directly into the building, he crossed the street toward the neighborhood where Lily always disappeared after packing away her flowers each afternoon. He stopped first at the small neighborhood florist that supplied fresh stems to restaurants and office lobbies. The elderly owner recognized Lily immediately. A warm smile crossed her face before fading into concern. "She is a sweet child," the woman said quietly. Every Friday, she picked up the flowers that were still beautiful but could not be sold over the weekend. She insisted on paying every dollar, even when I tried to give them to her. Ethan looked around the shop filled with roses, lilies, and daisies. "Do you know where she lives?" he asked gently. The woman hesitated for a moment before writing in. Address on the back of a receipt. It is an old apartment building on the west side. She never asked anyone for help. She only asked me to save the flowers that still had a few bright days left. Ethan thanked her and drove across the city himself, leaving his driver behind for the first time in months. The streets gradually changed. Glass towers gave way to aging brick buildings. Busy business districts softened into quiet residential blocks, and polished storefronts became neighborhood markets where everyone seemed to know one another. He parked outside a modest apartment building whose faded bricks had weathered decades of Chicago winters. Children played with sidewalk chalk near the entrance, while an elderly man swept fallen leaves from the front steps. Ethan climbed the narrow staircase until he reached the apartment number written on the receipt. Before he could knock, he noticed something resting beside the door. Several small flower bouquets lay carefully wrapped in brown paper, each tied with the same faded blue ribbon Lily always used. They had not been delivered. They had simply waited there, as though tomorrow had never arrived. Ethan knocked softly. No answer. He waited, then knocked again. This time slow footsteps approached from inside. The door opened only a few inches before a familiar pair of blue eyes appeared. Lily looked smaller than he remembered, dressed in a simple gray sweater with her hair loosely tied back. Surprise spread across her face. "Good morning, sir," she whispered automatically, despite the fact that it was already late afternoon. Ethan smiled for what felt like the first genuine time in years. "Good morning, Lily," he replied. Her eyes widened slightly. He had remembered her name. For a quiet moment, neither of them spoke. Then, from somewhere deeper inside the apartment, came the gentle sound of a woman coughing, followed by complete silence. Lily instinctively glanced over her shoulder before looking back at Ethan with the same brave smile she had offered every morning outside his office. It was a smile meant to protect someone else before protecting herself. For a moment, Ethan simply stood in the doorway, unsure whether he had come to help or whether, somehow, the little girl had already begun helping him. Lily stepped aside without saying a word, inviting him into a home no larger than one of the conference rooms inside Carter Global. The apartment was modest but remarkably tidy. Afternoon sunlight filtered through thin curtains, warming faded wooden floors that had been carefully swept. A small kitchen table stood against the wall with 2 bowls, 1 spoon, and a single vase holding 3 white daisies whose petals had already begun to droop. Ethan recognized the flowers immediately. They were the same kind she sold outside his building every morning. Beside the vase rested several handwritten cards, each no bigger than a business card. Curious, he picked one up with gentle hands. It read, "Someone needs this smile more than I do today." Another said, "Every flower reminds someone that tomorrow is worth waiting for." A third simply read, "Keep smiling. Someone is smiling because of you." Ethan looked toward Lily. "You wrote these?" She nodded shyly. "People look happier when they find a surprise inside the paper. Do they know it came from you?" She smiled softly. "It is better if they just feel better." Ethan lowered the card, unable to answer. Across the room, a quiet voice called Lily's name. She hurried toward the bedroom, leaving the door slightly open. Ethan did not intend to look inside, but from where he stood he caught a glimpse of a woman resting peacefully beneath a light blanket. Her face looked pale with exhaustion, yet when Lily adjusted the blanket and placed a fresh daisy on the bedside table, the woman smiled faintly before closing her eyes again. There were bottles of medicine arranged neatly beside a glass of water, along with a notebook filled with appointment dates written in careful handwriting. Nothing about the room spoke of despair. Instead, it spoke of quiet determination, the kind that survives one ordinary day at a time. Lily returned carrying an empty watering can. "Mom likes flowers because they make the room feel bigger," she explained. "When I sell enough bouquets, I always save one for her." Ethan glanced toward the unopened bundles resting beside the front door. "You never sold those?" Lily gently shook her head. "I could not leave her alone this week. I thought maybe next Monday." Her words carried no complaint, only hope. Ethan walked toward the bouquets and noticed that every ribbon had been tied with extraordinary care. Tucked inside each one was another handwritten note waiting for a stranger who might need encouragement more than flowers. Suddenly, he understood something that no financial statement had ever taught him. Lily had never been selling flowers. She had been quietly delivering hope, one bouquet at a time, while carrying burdens that would have overwhelmed many adults. The flowers paid for medicine. The notes lifted strangers. The smile protected her mother from worry. Ethan looked around the little apartment once more and realized that the richest person in the room was not the man wearing the tailored overcoat. It was the little girl who somehow found enough kindness to share with everyone else, even when she had so little for herself. As that truth settled quietly into his heart, Ethan reached into his pocket and felt the dried white daisy he had carried since finding the note beside the planter. For the first time in many years, he understood why he had never been able to throw it away. Ethan left the apartment just before sunset, but he did not return to the office. Instead, he sat alone inside his parked car, staring through the windshield as children laughed somewhere down the block and golden leaves drifted across the quiet street. His phone buzzed repeatedly with messages marked urgent, yet for the first time in decades, none of them felt important. His thoughts remained inside that small apartment where a little girl believed that a single flower could make a difficult day easier for someone she had never even met. He reached into his coat pocket and unfolded the tiny card once more. "I will come back when Mommy smiles again." The words no longer sounded like a promise from a child. They sounded like a responsibility that had quietly found its way into his own hands. The following morning, Ethan arrived at Carter Global before anyone else. Instead of walking into the executive conference room, he called his personal assistant into his office. "I need the best medical care available for someone in Chicago," he said calmly. "Specialists, transportation, home support if necessary. I want every option on my desk before noon." His assistant blinked with surprise. "Is this for a member of the board?" Ethan shook his head. "It is for someone who has spent months reminding people to smile." She did not ask another question. By early afternoon, a folder filled with recommendations covered his desk. Ethan reviewed every page himself, speaking with physicians, arranging consultations, and requesting that all expenses remain completely confidential. He wanted no publicity, no corporate announcement, and no charitable press release. This was not a business decision. It was simply the right thing to do. That evening, he returned to Lily's apartment carrying nothing more than a paper bag from a neighborhood bakery and a small bouquet of fresh white daisies. Lily opened the door with the same gentle smile she always wore. "Good evening, sir," she said softly. Ethan smiled back. "Good evening, Lily." He handed her the flowers. "These are for your mother." Lily accepted them carefully, almost as though they were something precious. "She will love them," she whispered. After a few quiet minutes speaking with Lily's mother, Ethan explained that he had arranged appointments with doctors who specialized in her condition and that transportation had already been scheduled. The woman looked at him with tearful gratitude. "I do not know how I could ever repay you," she said gently. Ethan looked toward Lily, who was trimming the flower stems with careful little hands before placing them into fresh water. "You already have," he answered honestly. As he prepared to leave, Lily walked him to the door. She hesitated for a moment before asking the question that had quietly rested in her heart all week. "When Mommy gets better, do you think I can sell flowers again?" Ethan looked down at the child whose kindness had reached thousands of strangers without any of them realizing it. He knelt until they were eye level. "I think you should always share flowers if they make people smile," he said warmly. "But I also think children deserve time to learn, to play, and to dream." Lily tilted her head thoughtfully. "Can I still give people little notes?" Ethan laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar even to himself. "I hope you never stop." Lily smiled with quiet relief. "Then tomorrow is going to be a good day." As Ethan stepped back into the cool evening air, he realized something extraordinary had happened. He had arrived hoping to rescue a little girl. Instead, she had already begun restoring a part of him that he believed had disappeared forever. The first snow of November arrived quietly, dusting Chicago with a thin blanket of white that softened the sharp edges of the city. Weeks had passed since Ethan first knocked on Lily's apartment door, and little by little, life had begun changing in ways neither of them could have imagined. Lily's mother had regained color in her face, her smile appearing more often than before. The apartment no longer felt weighed down by uncertainty. Fresh flowers stood beside the window every morning, filling the small rooms with gentle color and the faint scent of hope. Lily still wrote her tiny notes by hand, But now she slipped them inside books borrowed from the library, left them beside cups of coffee for neighbors, and tucked them into bouquets she made at home simply because she believed kind words should keep traveling. Ethan found himself visiting every Saturday, never announcing his arrival in advance. Sometimes he brought warm cinnamon rolls from the neighborhood bakery. Sometimes he carried groceries. Other times he simply came to hear Lily tell stories about the people she hoped would smile because of a flower or a handwritten message. One afternoon, while walking through the bright marble lobby of Carter Global, Ethan stopped near the large windows overlooking the familiar sidewalk. The empty corner beside the planter remained untouched, and suddenly an idea settled quietly into his mind. 2 weeks later, employees arriving for work noticed something new inside the building's entrance. Near the lobby cafe stood a beautiful wooden flower cart decorated with white daisies, blue ribbons, and a simple hand-painted sign that read, "Take a smile with you." Every bouquet contained one of Lily's handwritten notes, each encouraging someone to slow down, believe in tomorrow, or remember that kindness always finds its way home. The flowers were available for anyone who wished to brighten another person's day. Beside the cart stood a small donation box, but no prices. Anyone could give whatever they wished, and every dollar supported neighborhood families facing medical hardships. Ethan refused to place the company logo anywhere near the display. This was never about publicity. It was about continuing something beautiful that had already begun on a sidewalk outside the building. On the morning the flower cart officially opened, Lily stepped through the revolving doors wearing the same bright smile that had greeted Ethan for months. This time, however, she was not standing outside in the cold. She carefully arranged fresh bouquets beneath the warm lights of the lobby while employees gathered around with genuine excitement. Some recognized her immediately. Others only recognized the feeling they had missed every morning she had been gone. Ethan watched quietly from across the lobby until Lily carried one final bouquet toward him. Tied around the flowers was the familiar faded blue ribbon she had always used. She handed them to him with both hands. "This one is for you," she said softly. Ethan smiled. "Can I pay for it this time?" Lily shook her head with a playful grin that reminded him of the very first daisy she had ever given him. "It is already paid for," she answered. Ethan gently untied the ribbon and found another handwritten card tucked inside the bouquet. In careful letters it read, "Thank you for helping Mommy smile again." He looked at the flowers, then at the little girl standing before him, and quietly realized that the brightest thing inside the entire building had never been the glass walls reaching toward the sky. It had always been the child who believed one small act of kindness could bloom into something far greater than anyone expected. Winter settled comfortably over Chicago, and before anyone realized it, the flower cart inside Carter Global had become as familiar as the morning coffee waiting in the lobby. Employees no longer hurried past without looking. Some paused to read Lily's handwritten notes before beginning difficult days. Others carried bouquets to coworkers celebrating milestones, welcoming new babies, or simply needing encouragement after a challenging week. Visitors often asked who had started such a thoughtful tradition, but the answer was never displayed on a plaque or printed inside a company brochure. Ethan preferred it that way. He believed kindness lost none of its power by remaining quiet. Every weekday, instead of arriving at exactly 8:12 a.m. and disappearing into meetings, Ethan entered the building 10 minutes earlier. Before opening his calendar or answering a single email, he walked directly to the flower cart. Sometimes Lily was already there, carefully trimming stems while humming softly to herself. Other mornings she had already left for school, but a fresh bouquet always waited with another handwritten note tucked inside the paper. Ethan never began his day without reading it. His collection slowly filled an entire drawer in his office. One read, "Hope grows when someone decides not to walk away." Another simply said, "Every person you notice becomes a little less alone." They were written by a child, yet they carried the kind of wisdom many adults searched a lifetime to discover. As spring returned to the city, Lily's mother grew stronger with every passing month. She began volunteering at a neighborhood community garden, teaching children how to care for flowers and vegetables alike. The apartment that once felt quiet and uncertain now echoed with laughter, fresh music, and plans for the future. Lily no longer needed to spend early mornings selling bouquets on the sidewalk. Instead, she focused on school, where her teachers quickly discovered the same compassion that strangers had witnessed outside Carter Global. She started a small kindness club that encouraged students to write encouraging notes for classmates who might be having difficult days. The idea spread farther than anyone expected. One afternoon, nearly a year after Ethan first noticed the empty corner outside his building, he stood beside the lobby windows watching pedestrians cross the same familiar sidewalk. The stone planter remained exactly where it had always been, but now it reminded him of beginnings rather than absences. Lily walked over carrying one final white daisy. Without saying a word, she placed it gently into his hand. Ethan looked down at the flower and smiled. "I still think this one is worth paying for," he said. Lily laughed softly. "You already did," she answered. "Not with money." Ethan understood exactly what she meant. He looked out across the busy streets where thousands of people hurried toward destinations they believed mattered most. Somewhere among them were countless stories waiting to be noticed, countless quiet acts of courage hidden in ordinary mornings, and countless opportunities to stop before walking past someone who simply needed to be seen. He closed his hand gently around the daisy and realized the greatest investment he had ever made had never appeared on a balance sheet. It had begun the moment he chose to notice a little girl everyone else had almost learned to overlook. And from that day forward, every flower he carried reminded him that true wealth was never measured by the height of a building, the size of a company, or the numbers inside a bank account. It was measured by the lives that quietly bloomed because one person finally stopped long enough to care.